Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural session of the 2019 Summer Learning Series. My name is Piers Weigers, and I'm the coordinator for Child Rights Training Program. Before we go on, I just want to remind you to mute yourself during most of the presentation. We'll have a chance for some Q&A later on, but during the session, just to cut down on some of that background noise, it would be great if you can just hit that mute button. But again, when you do comment later on, please don't forget to unmute yourself. So today's session is titled Trust and Teamwork, Best Practices for Collaborative Research, and we are very excited to welcome our two facilitators to the virtual stage today. First, we have Julia Orkin, staff pediatrician at the Hospital for Sick Kids, as well as Kate Robson, who is the parent coordinator at the Sunnybrook Neonatal Follow-Up Clinic. Together, Julia and Kate are involved with Child Rights Coached Coordinated Enhanced Neonatal Transition Project, which is exploring a novel intervention which aims at supporting families of infants diagnosed with serious and chronic conditions manage that transition from the hospital to home. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over the virtual podium to you, Julia and Kate. So let me hand over the screen, and then you are free to get started.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just wait to get the slides up. Okay. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful welcome, Pierre. This is Julia Orkin here, as well as Kate Robson. So I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction, and then Kate and I will be collaborating and sharing the stage, describing our experiences and our learnings to date. I think the most important thing is that we're hopeful that this is collaborated with those who are on the line, and that we are really facilitating a discussion, learning from our own experiences and hoping to gain insights in moving forward. So thank you for having us today. So why are we both here? We're really here to explore how researchers and families and patient advisors can build a strong foundation for collaboration. Hopeful that the next 5 to 10 years brings further innovations in the way we engage as researchers, clinicians, and advisors. Our objectives for this talk is to understand how and why to engage patient and family advisors early in the research cycle, to create communication models that help all participants remain involved, and manage changes or conflicts with flexible approaches. We're going to be sharing some of our own personal experiences together that we've had in our Child Rights project, but also amongst other projects and clinical environments that we both have worked in. So to start with a small quote, and it really stemmed from both Kate and I wanting to share why we chose this topic to present on and why it really resonated with both of us as important. So if we want to feel an undying passion for our work, if we want to feel we are contributing to something bigger than ourselves, we all need to know our why. And the truth is, why are we here and why are we advocating moving forward? So I'm going to start with my story and then hand over the audio to Kate to tell her story. So you see 3 pictures here on your screen. The top picture is Owen, a little boy that I've had the pleasure of caring for. I met him when he was roughly 8 months of age. This is him very early on, near to the time that he was born. The picture with his father is the first time his father, Brandon, is holding Owen, and the bottom is when his big sister Zoe is meeting him, and his mom Julie. Julie is the parent advisor, one of many parent advisors on our CSEN team, and the parent advisory lead for our complex care family advisory here at Sick Kids. And I share these pictures because I think they translate very clearly into what we're hoping to do with the CSEN project. We're hoping to ease that transition from hospital to home, recognizing the challenges that come with parenting a brand new baby that has medical challenges, has uncertainty in terms of their course, has an unexpected entry into the world, and a disjointed and different parenting experience. It's not typical that as a dad, the first time you're holding your baby, he's connected with tubes and nurse has to show you how to do it properly. Or when you're meeting your baby brother, he's behind, for all intents and purposes, what might look like a cage for a big sister. And how can we ease this process? The story then continued for me to show you pictures of Owen now. He still has medical technology, a central line, a feeding tube, but that doesn't stop him from being a kid on skis, playing hockey on skates, and having an incredibly well-rounded life. And this is what urges me and pushes me to be the best clinician and researcher I can be, to ensure that the life that my patients and research participants have is the best that it can be. And then this is a picture of me and Julie just this year presenting grand rounds collaboratively at CHIO on the role of family advisors and complex care. And so this is sort of the pinnacle, I'd say, that, you know, I had the ability to care for a baby from a very young age, see him grow into a big boy, and then collaborate with his mother to make sure that she keeps me true to the work I'm doing and pushes me to be the best researcher I can be. So that's why I'm here today.
And hi there, everyone. It's Kate here. And this is my why. So these photos are pretty old now, hence the black and white. Actually, in all honesty, that one picture is black and white because I'm wearing such an ugly green shirt in that photo, and I can't bear it. It was taken when my little 25-week, 500-gram baby was a few weeks into her very long hospital stay. And I wasn't thinking about what I was wearing, and I was certainly not thinking about how it might show up in future presentations. And that next photo is that baby a few years later visiting her little sister who had been born at 32 weeks. Next slide, Julia, please. And we're jumping forward in time to now, and lots of things have changed. So they still like each other, which is really nice. But my experience with both of them, and in the 4 hospitals where between all of us we received care, it changed all of our lives. So I came to work as a family support specialist, parent coordinator at Sunnybrook in the NICU and now the neonatal follow-up clinic, and I've been there almost 10 years. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to connect with thousands of families, and I've become, as I think most people are in the NICU, very passionate about finding ways to support babies, families, and staff through all our experiences. And so that's what really interested me about the research project that Julia and I and a number of amazing teammates are engaged in right now, the CSENT project, because it has such potential to make real change, a real improvement in the experience of families. And this photo in the bottom corner here, it's of our graduates lined up at the preemie picnic. So it's not really research related, but it's super cute. So I really wanted to share it. Next slide, please. So these words come from a fabulous talk done by Julie Bull about collaborative research in Indigenous communities. And as soon as we are done this webinar, I would highly recommend you Google it and watch it. It's a great use of your time. And these words here really resonated with me about how research, especially related to the types of things we care about and are studying, research is relational. And the structures that we create within our research, whether they're between researchers or researchers and patients, researchers and families, these structures have an impact on the work that we do. So in other words, how we do it is as important as what we do. And I also think these words remind us that if we ever feel disconnected from our why in research, if we're focusing on something that feels disconnected from a greater entity, then we can recenter ourselves by widening our scope or widening our gaze so that we remember that all research, not just patient-oriented research, but all research ideally leads to a change that makes someone's life better. But yes, none of this can happen without a strong foundation within your team. And I will ask Julia to tell us about that.
Excellent, thanks, Kate. So this is what we are describing as the foundation for teamwork, with 4 components as puzzle pieces that all fit together equally in order to create the outcome that you're hopeful for. So we have respect, transparency, responsiveness, and flexibility, which we will go through each one by one. And I think the critical thing here is that what we are asking individuals to do, what we're advocating for, is that individuals from very different backgrounds, from very different experiences in life come together to work towards a common goal. And if you think about it, the teamwork is very important, whatever the environment is, but in some ways it's more complicated here. And I give the example that if you are all soccer players coming to play together on a soccer team, you have a very clear shared understanding of what the goal of the soccer game is. You know your role, you know where you're playing, you know the goal in terms of the outcome that you hope, which might be a win. Here, can we imagine that if you suddenly had soccer players and accountants coming together, and an accountant has never played soccer before, there would need to be a different amount of explaining, patience, understanding in terms of the process and the outcome. And that because we're sitting here as family members, clinicians, researchers, we all have different backgrounds, and that the ability to understand your role and your clarity is essential. So for example, I can give from our own experience here in the complex care program and our family advisory, we actually sit down together as a group at the beginning of each meeting and saying who we are and what our goals and hopes for the meeting are. So we can actually hear and explain what might be the same or what might be different, and why that's okay.
So here, let's engage with this first piece or building block, and it's how do we cultivate and show respect for our team members? And one really critical point is early engagement, is inviting partners in at the very beginning, at the very top of this cycle, and knowing that this might mean changing priorities and research questions. And I think one theme that often comes up, it's definitely in my own experience and within the wider patient partner community, it's that nobody feels particularly good about being a ticked box on a checklist or being asked to validate work that's virtually complete. So, I think patient partners especially, but all partners feel very strongly about, bring us in at the start. I want to touch briefly on the topic of recruitment, of finding partners to work with. So in CSENT, we had a very complex process because we wanted complex representation. We were thinking about geography, gender, experience, background, medical experiences, and so on. And there's no way around this being a very challenging process, something that for us remains a moving target and remains an area of focus. And it's also been enormously rewarding. Our hope is that this process will help ensure that the scope of what we do isn't limited to just a lucky few who match the easy demographics. And again, this process is not about box ticking, but it's rooted in a deep respect for people's wisdom that comes out of their lived experience. And another point I'd like to share is that a mistake or a misstep, let's say, I've observed it, I've definitely made it myself. We often front load our energy into recruitment and initiating projects, and we don't always keep putting that energy back into the cycle at different moments. So it can be useful to think of each stage as a mini project that deserves its own attention, enthusiasm, and focus, and that keeps it a profoundly respectful process for everyone engaged. And I think it's also useful to think about some best practices and considerations to keep team members engaged along the way, and I will ask Julia to discuss.
Excellent. So I think the first thing to recognize in terms of the respect pathway and time is to recognize that everyone is hoping for the same end goal, success in the research project and change in terms of the interaction clinically, whatever that might be down the road. The challenge is balancing all the pieces. So the recognition that time is needed from the family and patient advisors, and that this may not be in all cases a paid role, or it might be a paid role in balance with everything else that they're doing. They may be at a different workplace, they might be in the home caring for their child, they may be balancing many different research projects. So that the ask that we do require of them can sometimes be great, and to recognize that. For example, the time it may take to complete a doodle poll, for example, might be the 35 minutes that they have to dedicate to your project in that week. So to recognize that there is a time and a place, and how can we respect and actually have open communication around how much time do you have to give towards this project, and making sure that we match it accordingly. The other point that we want to make is around information. And so there's in our society, there's an ease with providing a lot of information. We can send an email with a lot of attachments. We can provide an abundance. Let's say we can provide them with page after page of literature or the grant application or whatever it might be. Recognizing that getting a wealth of information, on one hand, we want to ensure that our family and patient advisors are as up to date as we are. We also don't want to inundate them with potentially more than is required. Once again, finding that balance between the correct amount of information, the amount of information they need to be put up to speed, but we absolutely do not want is to not inform. And I think this is coming back to that concept of best practice, which we'll get to. The worst thing you could imagine is being put into a meeting room and not knowing who's in the room, what the expectations are of you in that room, and what the outcome is meant to be of that meeting. And so it's once again that balance between the amount of time it might take to digest the correct information and be able to know your role. The last piece is around authenticity. And this is the recognition that everybody actually wants to make a difference. They want to be heard and they want to provide good work towards the end goal of the project. And so how can we ensure that what we are actually allowing team members to create is valuable? If we don't provide enough information, or we inundate them with too much and so they don't have enough time to put towards the actual meat of the work, then you actually are not going to feel good as a team member that you're able to provide what the team needs. So an example would be, let's say we're talking about developing a website, for example, but we're not clear around what the website is needing. And one member of the team does a fantastic job making a video of their family and their experience, but we don't have the capability potentially to put up a video. How would you engage with that as a team, really taking a step back to say, actually, maybe we should have been a lot clearer at the beginning around what the expectations were, what the website can actually hold, and what your role as a team member is, before someone actually goes and creates a whole host of work that potentially may not be usable, which in the end makes nobody feel that they were an integral member of the team. So I'm going to pass it on to Kate to talk about the next section.
Thank you. So I think these questions here, and Julia's brought up these themes, and I think that we really have to keep asking throughout the life cycle of our projects, because these are not questions that we can answer once and be done with, right? We have to come back to them again and again. But we want to know, what is everybody expecting? Are we clear and transparent about our own expectations? And this requires relationship, this requires communication, right? And this is especially important with people with these different bodies of knowledge. And this speaks exactly to what Julia was discussing earlier. This helps us be transparent, it keeps things feasible, it keeps things achievable, and it keeps the engagement meaningful and purposeful for everyone. And we want to focus on clarity of roles and responsibilities. And something that we do in my unit, we've done on a lot of research projects, and we're definitely doing within CSENT, is this idea of partnership and buddying with new team members. And this is any team member, not just parent partners or community members, but for anybody joining a project, assigning somebody whose responsibility is to welcome them, right? Somebody who sets up meetings for them and lets them know exactly what to expect, somebody who debriefs afterwards, somebody who helps you. I had that when I joined this unit. I had people who were, I mean, lovely people, but they were also officially assigned as my buddy. And the goal was so that I would never feel out of place or confused or wondering what happens next. And that was a really transformative experience for me. It helped me come into a space where I might feel very vulnerable, but it helped me feel safe and good in that space. And that was really, really important. So we also want to keep clarity around this idea of, does everybody know what happens next, right? So further to that, do we have clear and established communications channels, right? As a team, this is a collaborative decision. And this is something that we've had a lot of back and forth on this, and that we've tried a lot of things, and a lot of them haven't worked, right? Things not working within the context of a project, it's not failure, it's experimentation, right? So for example, people get so much email clutter, so it's really easy for important messages to get lost in emails. So our family team said, let's do a Facebook group. And we're like, okay. So we did that. We set up a Facebook group, and it's not really being used. That's okay. The point is to keep trying. The point is to collaboratively decide, what are we going to try together? And then keep up that commitment to communication, to keep it going and to keep it consistent. This thing here about a closed communication loop, what I mean by that is it really clear that it's someone's job to make sure minutes get sent out, major changes or developments get communicated. If team members are being asked to take action, the results of those actions are communicated back to us in a timely manner. So if somebody's asked me to do work and I've done it, I would really love to know what happens with it. This is even true, I would say, in the life cycle of the entire study. Like in some of the studies that I've been involved in as a participant or as a study subject, I don't know, dozens and dozens of them I've been involved in. Twice I've been informed of what the results were. And that was really meaningful to me to know, okay, so the way I contributed to this study, now I'm getting that information back. That meant a lot to me. So I think generally speaking, if we can close that loop for participants in the study as well, I think that's really powerful and important. And now onto my least favorite topic, which is conflict. After 47 years of avoiding conflict, I'm trying to learn how to engage with it. I won't say I welcome it, but I am trying to engage with it. Because something that I've learned is that within, I think in lots of environments, but definitely within the research environment, if you're never experiencing conflict or disagreement, it means you're not doing anything interesting, right? If it's all easy, then you're probably not exploring or discovering anything new. And so we did have a conflict come up in our study. We realized that in order to ensure the validity or the quality of our intervention, because we're doing these lovely acceptance and commitment groups, and it was proposed very reasonably that we record them so we could assess a few of them and make sure that the clinician who's doing the intervention is doing it well. And that makes a lot of sense from a research perspective. I really struggled with this idea because a number of times parents in the group had told us that very explicitly, we really need a safe space. We love having this safe space where we can talk about it, things. They were being incredibly vulnerable in these groups. And I got really worried about how recording them might affect that. Would we be introducing them? Would we be taking away this opportunity for them? Now, because we have a strong relational base in our team, I felt okay bringing this up. I felt like I could bring it to the group. And I was super uncomfortable about it because I really respect the researchers we work with, and I understood why it was important for them. But they made it pretty easy for me. I was able to say, this is my concern. And I think because we have this notion of why, we have a really strong why in common. We have a common value. We have an area of agreement. We all want the study to be strong, but we also all care about we want to preserve and protect the experience of parents in the study. So when we centered our values in the discussion, and we realized they're similar, so it was pretty easy to find a solution that supported the needs of the research and also supported the needs of the families involved. And part of this, a really, really huge part of this, I mean, the flexibility of the research team, super important. But the other thing was that we have this very active parent advisory group, and we were able to reach out for guidance, and we got some really surprising but really useful information from them about possible ways we could achieve our goals. So right now, I feel like I'm kind of setting Julia up here, but Julia, you said something when we were working on this presentation that is one of my favorite quotes of all time about research, and that's what's on the next slide. So sorry to set you up like that, but I love it. I love it so much.
So hold your suspense. I think I just want to add one piece to the conflict or disagreement that Kate mentioned. So when we presented the information to set this up for the next slide, we presented this discussion around audio recording that there had been a recommendation that we audio record, and it was very clear that we heard that there were some concerns, and that I think a typical response that I felt sort of internally, but also from my research framework, was that, okay, well, we need this from our research to make it scientifically sound, to ensure that there's fidelity across all sites, that there's no other way to do it. That was my initial response. But then actually what was required was a lot of time, a lot of patience, and some brainstorming around alternatives. And that what we actually landed on was that if it turns out that audio recording in the neonatal intensive care setting with sensitive topics that require in-depth reflection, and we were allowing participants to consent to it, if no participant consented, then we actually could say it was not feasible to audio record for the following reasons. And that discussing it through with the family advisory, discussing it with my colleague, actually allowed us to come to a place that I think could add to the scientific literature in a different way. And I think from our end, it required flexibility, and leading to the next slide, it required us to think in a slightly different way. So this leads us to the next puzzle piece, which is flexibility. And the line, what I get, and what I get, I actually hear. And what that means is whatever the patient family advisory can give to the project is what they can give to the project. And so we as researchers need to be flexible in terms of what we offer. So for example, whether it's the Facebook group, whether it's responding by emails, whether it's joining in on a call, whether it's editing on their own, whether it's developing a PowerPoint, whatever that individual family advisor skill set is, their time available, their desire, their likes or dislikes, you couldn't pay me enough money to make a video, but if someone else loves making videos, then I want to engage with their skill set and where their desire lies. And that there really can't be an expectation on my end in terms of what they do, but they need to come to the table in their own way, and I have to then reflect on whatever it is that I receive back. So for example, I cannot engage with the family advisory team to get sort of like a stamp of approval. That is not the role, and nor should it be the role. As Kate said, if we want to actually push boundaries and move forward, we need to have healthy dialogue where people are comfortable to actually say that that's not a very good idea, or there's no way that that would be feasible. For example, in the CSENT project, the transition from hospital home is our focus. So we had developed sort of an outline where the nurse navigator would call the families once a week, we said. And then when we presented it to the family advisory, a lot of people were like, well, I can't actually pick up my phone once a week because I'm busy breastfeeding or pumping or rushing around to appointments. I actually can't even check my voicemail. What I would really like is if the nurse navigator could text me, because texting I can respond to when I'm breastfeeding or whatever it is I'm doing. We took that feedback and actually really resonated with us. We faced a lot of challenges. We are actually currently not able to text message as a part of our research paradigm due to other barriers, but it really highlighted to me that we need to be able to be flexible and change and adapt, and that we are continuing to work toward that goal. Because if our intervention is connecting and supporting, but the only way we're providing intervention is through phone calls, and no mom in that crazy time in their life is able to pick up a phone call, then how is their intervention actually going to be successful? And so that's what we continue to struggle with and continue to push forward on. What you see in the picture here is the Goldilocks, the three little bears. So one is just right, one is too hot, one is too cold. And that there's actually no right way to interact with a research project as a family advisor, and there's no right way to interact with a research project as a clinician or as a researcher. That all we can do is create options, create pathways, and create an openness to hear and reflect, and actually then to respond accordingly. So really, this takes us to this component of what I actually hear. So whatever it is you may hear, you actually need to then communicate back in that closed loop fashion that Kate mentioned to actually show change. Or if there is no change, what are the barriers to change? Where are the limitations? Where are the struggles? What we realize in our process is by explaining why we couldn't do something, it allowed for a much more robust dialogue in terms of, oh, there are a lot of barriers that you face in research, and this is why. Rather than, oh, the researcher or the clinical team don't really understand our situation and the intervention is a mismatch between our needs. And that actually we feedback. So for example, in a clinical setting, we had a lot of feedback that families were coming to our clinic and didn't understand the role of the clinic. We thought we had written out very clearly what the role of the clinic was. We said you come to clinic 7, you meet a doctor and a nurse practitioner, this is what you do. You may meet a dietitian and sort of outlined it. But the families actually said to us was, no, what we actually need is we need to know, where do we park? How long does it take to park? Is there babysitting or childcare for our other children? Where is the closest room where I could plug in my feeding pump or change a diaper? And so we actually realized that what we thought needed to be in a clinic pamphlet was completely different than the families actually needed in a clinic pamphlet. And by engaging with our family advisory, we created what we would argue is a much better family-centered pamphlet that has the information they need, as well as with some of the medical information that we wanted to convey. And what we got in the end was a product that was much further along, and I hope better for the families that were coming. And I think the last one here is that if there's something that is not feasible, that we allow the process to take place. So to figure out why, even if you know ahead of time, even if someone presented me, a proposition. So let's say someone said, I just gave birth, my baby's ready to be discharged home, but I'm very tired. I would really love if I could stay in the hospital for 3 days with support and massage and manicure, pedicure, and get my hair cut. All these things that sound lovely that I'm sure would actually help parental well-being. But why is that not feasible? And instead of just saying, like laughing and saying, oh, haha, that's not feasible, why don't we take a step back and say, okay, you know what, that's really interesting. Maybe there's something we could do. Maybe we could see if there's someone who can donate their time to provide haircuts for families or whatever it might be. So actually to be able to take your researcher clinician lens, hear the feedback, and then adapt and support and educate and come to some common pathway to get a little bit further on your process. So let's leave this for the last slide. I'll let Kate start.
Thank you. I think we've talked about a lot of these individual points, and the thing that I want to spend a little bit of time on here is number 10, right? The celebrating successes, because I think that that's something that we don't do a lot of. I think that it's partially because everybody in this sphere is very busy. There's, patient partners, researchers, everybody's, your schedules are chock full. It's always on to the next task, on to the next thing to do, on to the next responsibility. And we aren't taking time to celebrate together. And I think that's a real shame. I think that there's, especially because this can be very emotional work. It can be, for patient partners, for example, coming into clinical spaces, that can feel very vulnerable. You're going back to some really difficult times of your life, and you're kind of mining that for the benefit of a project. That can be tough. And I think it's tough for researchers as well. I think it's tough because sometimes the subject material is really tough, but also because there's so many barriers that come up, like what Julia was talking about with not being able to do texting when people really want us to be able to do texting. And there's some things that we can work on together and solve, and there's some things that we can't find a way around. And so this process can be frustrating and difficult and time consuming. And so taking time to celebrate those wins, well, first communicating the wins, but celebrating them, I think is really important. A few years ago, I was involved in the initial family integrated care pilot that was done at Mount Sinai. And I think that was a real model of, it was a great team approach. And it feels very similar to me. The CSENT project feels very similar to me in the way that it's been sort of a team-based thing from the very beginning. But that project, they invited people in at the very, very beginning. I unfortunately missed the initial fact-finding trip to Estonia, but I got on the bandwagon a little bit after that. Parents were part of every part of the study, from designing the consent forms and the research questions and all of that. And then at the very end of it, they actually held a party. And they invited everybody back to the hospital, all the family advisors, and they also invited back a lot of the participants in the study. So all the FICARE parents were invited back. And there was a really lovely gathering. It's the first thing of that kind that I'd ever been a part of. I don't know how common that is. I feel like it's not that common. And I'm just sort of putting it out there that I think when possible, it should be. Because I think that it's the kind of thing that, going back to where our discussion initiated, that it really helps us kind of tie into this idea of, like, why are we even doing this work in the first place, right? We're doing this work because it's meaningful to us, because we hope that it's going to have meaning for somebody else. And so when we have moments when we can celebrate that, I think it's really valuable. It may not be in a big project. It may not be feasible because you're doing something with people across the country, or, but what other kind of way can you come together and celebrate? And I think that that's, probably a topic for a whole other webinar, but I think that it's worth putting some time into and to think about, because through celebration, you can actually address all of these needs. Like, you're showing respect, you're coming together as equals, you're being responsive to the emotional needs of the people in your project, and the informational needs, right? So celebration is a big bucket that a lot of things fall into. So Julia, anything you'd like to add to any of these points?
No, I'm actually in complete agreement with you, and I think that we probably don't celebrate success enough in general. And I think from, for example, Kate had mentioned in terms of our diverse group, we were able to recruit families from every site, so across the country, to be representative on our family advisory. And the first meeting we had, some was in person, some was online. It was so satisfying, and even just, we should have celebrated in that moment. Like, look what we've done. We're all coming together. We are actually working towards this common goal. It was one of the most, exciting parts of being a part of Child Right so far for me.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the interesting thing coming at this from the patient perspective, is this idea of, so within CSENT, we have our kind of micro community, and that's become a very positive, wonderful place to be. And then within the Child Right network at large, we have access to this community, right? We have access to a community of people who, like, we all care about the same things. Our pathways into caring might be different, but they're really important to us, and they're really powerful. So figuring out ways of celebrating together, beyond the, we have these yearly meetings, and those can be really wonderful. But thinking about ways to celebrate together, I think it's important to keep people connected, to keep up the energy, and to keep us focused on the why of why we're doing this work together and why it matters. So that's kind of a challenge to the Child Bright people. How can we have more fun together about this stuff?
So I think if everyone is okay, we're going to open it up to some questions or comments or your own experiences that you would like to share with the group. Please feel free.
And I've also got my eye on the chat window. So feel free to chat them in.
Thank you, Julie and Kate. So it's a free-for-all. Just ensure that you unmute yourself and feel free to ask away.
Perhaps if you could think about any questions of examples we gave or challenges that you're currently facing within your projects, we're happy to talk about specific examples as well.
All right, so it's Pierre here. So maybe I'll try to get the ball rolling. And so yeah, thanks again for that really great session that described some of the elements that really need to be in place to establish that relationship between researchers and patient partners so that you can set the stage for this collaborative relationship. Now, one of the, I guess, aspects that I've been thinking about a bit lately is that it seems that when you are embarking on this endeavor, that those engagement efforts are really more easily implemented from the start. But I was wondering, when it comes to those middle phases of the research project, when you are collecting data or analyzing the input, how do you keep that momentum for engagement going? And I guess, and allowing for your patient partners to still be involved to some degree?
I think that's a really good question, because a lot of those middle stages, and I'm trying to speak carefully because I don't want to offend any researchers who love numbers and data, but I'm not a numbers and data person, right? And I find those middle sections when stuff's being analyzed, and you've got kind of under the hood type of work going on. For me, that's, I'll be blunt, not the most interesting part of the project, right? The most interesting part for me is when you're actually engaging with the participants, or when you're developing the materials and all of that, or when you're disseminating it, when you're doing the knowledge translation at the end. So I think you bring up a really important challenge, that there are times of it where there's going to be a lot going on, but there's not going to be a lot that's shareable necessarily. And that's where I think figuring out there are other things that you can be sharing with your community to keep them engaged, to keep them reminded that you're there. It may be that there's not something particularly meaningful for them to do in that moment, but just sending out information that comes out. There's one project that I'm a part of. It's actually a quality improvement project, and so in those kind of fallow periods for the advisory team, we're getting. They're sending us news articles that they think are interesting or related. They're still doing stuff to foster that sense of connection with the team. So I think that's one strategy for getting through those periods where there are fewer opportunities for meaningful engagement with outside partners.
Great, thank you. So I was taking a look at the chat box, and we did get a response from Bryn, so I'll just read it out. And so the challenge that Bryn and their group are having is that the challenge is that after the initial meeting, the enthusiasm sort of drops off a bit. Have you ever had to address that beforehand to, again, I guess, keep that momentum going after the initial enthusiastic response?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. What we have tried to do as part of our team is to, once a month, post something on the Facebook page for the CSAN Family Advisory. We send regular updates, and that we do have regular calls with the research team, families being included in that, just to check in like we would with any other team member. The other piece that we do is that with each family that's involved in each individual site, we involve them in the direct research component. So for example, we're about to start at UBC, and the hope would be that every few weeks we have a meeting to talk about some of the logistics. And then actually a parent who's gone through the NICU, if the issue is around recruitment, they actually may have a lot more suggestions around recruitment that we may know coming as a PI from many kilometers away. So recognizing what the unique role could be for each individual and making sure that we can engage in a way that's meaningful. And if there's nothing to do, it's okay to say that there's nothing to do.
Yeah, and I do think that the point that I think it's Bryn that you bring up, this question, does one person make it their deliverable to keep checking in? I think that's actually a really good strategy to make sure that somebody, it's sort of akin to the buddy idea that I mentioned earlier, that it's somebody's job to keep reaching out and keep connecting with people, because I think, we're all kind of laboring under these to-do lists, which are just kind of insane sometimes. And so we really do have to put it on our schedule and make it an explicit priority to keep engaging with people and keep them in the loop, right? Even if part of being in the loop is to say, hey, we're in this period now where there's not a lot happening, but we're still here. That's enough. But I agree with you that it does have to be somebody's job to do that, because otherwise it's the kind of thing that can really fall off your radar pretty quickly. And then you realize, oh my gosh, it's been like 2 months and we haven't really communicated with anybody. And the other thing I want to say is that sometimes, when we talk about these things, especially on a recorded webinar, we always make it sound so, positive, like we're never running into anything. And we run into real challenges keeping people engaged because people are busy. People are out in the world, they're doing stuff, they're living lives with their families. They're busy, right? And sometimes, especially if it's a complex request, somebody might glance at it on their phone, but then they think I'll get back to it later, and later never comes. So we've had challenges in terms of getting people to respond to things in a way that's helpful for us. It helps that we have very strong relationships with our family advisors, and we know them all. We've put the work into developing those relationships, so we can follow up and beg and plead. But we generally are able to get the responses we need. But it's not easy, and I think that's an important point to stress: is that it's not easy. If you're finding it not easy, you're not alone. I don't think anybody in Childbright is finding it easy. But I think all of that says is that it's, nothing worth doing is particularly easy. I think we just need to keep learning from each other and practicing and trying new things. It's never going to be the case that we find, as Julia said earlier with the Goldilocks slide, we're never going to find that perfect algorithm that makes it easy to get all your parents and all your family advisors engaged and stay engaged. There's not going to be one recipe that works for everybody. We have to be open to the idea of trying a lot of things and having a lot of things not work very well. And we have to set aside time for that in our project plans. Somebody has to be given the gift of time to do that work, because if they're just layering that on top of everything else and data analysis and blah, 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 it's not going to happen, right? So we have to consider this a priority in all of our projects and give the person whose job it is, we give them the time to do it.
I see that in the chat, and I completely agree that Patricia Birch added, keeping the initial enthusiasm going is much easier if the research is parent initiated and therefore their stake in it and commitment to it is high. I think that's an incredible point, that actually if they see that their value, they see the outcome they're hopeful for, then they're going to feel truly embedded in the work, and their enthusiasm will follow along suit.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's not easy as a parent representative or a patient family advisor to have an idea and to have your idea be carried forth. It's very hard. There aren't that many pathways in this country for true patient or family member initiated research projects, right? I hope I'm wrong about this, and if I am wrong about it, I would love for people to jump into the chat and tell me where those opportunities are. But I haven't seen too much in this country, and I think that's a really interesting question. I do think I'd like to sort of open the door to researchers to say, you know the methodology, you know how to make it happen, but maybe an interesting pathway might be for researchers to kind of open the doors to family members and say, I'm interested in working with somebody on something in this sort of general area of discharge or neonatology or whatever area. Bring your ideas to me, and I can help you make them happen. That would be a really interesting framework. And as far as I know, I haven't seen too many examples of that. Oh, and any advice for engaging patient partners who are traditionally not heard in the system, vulnerable or marginalized, less resourced or privileged families? Thank you for asking this, because I think this is a really, really important question, and I think this is another area where it's so hard because when we center our projects in hospitals, hospitals are not always easy to get to. They can be places of trauma for people. They're not necessarily places that feel great to step into. And so one technique is, if you want to do participatory research or community-based research, is to actually get out of the hospital and go into communities. I've seen some wonderful presentations about this. This wonderful parent and family advisor, Sue Robbins, wrote actually a very beautiful poem about this, about actually going to people's homes, going into communities and meeting them there, because those can be places where people feel a lot more safe talking, and also it's more convenient for them, right? Because most of what we do within hospitals, it's not convenient for anybody, let alone parents who have to come from far away, right? I think they also, ChildBright collaborated with CIHR a while ago and SPORE on a compensation guidelines document, and I think this is a topic for a whole webinar, and I'm kind of throwing this in at the end. But I think that figuring out a compensation strategy to make sure that people are not sacrificing financially when they're contributing to your project, I think that's really important, and it's especially important for marginalized communities, because we have to understand that their contribution, they're giving up something in order to participate in this project, and we need to honor that. So I think those, again, not easy. I think it's a combination of strategies that will, but usually the strategies make it, put the burden of the work on that of the burden of the outreach on the back of the researcher as opposed to the community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that insight, Julia and Kate. So if no other questions, I guess we can, we'll be nearing the end. And we do expect to have the recording of this webinar available later today, along with some of the slides that the facilitators were willing to share with us. And yeah, so check your inbox. We'll be sending that out later. And if you haven't had a chance to look at some of the other webinar offerings we are producing in the series, we have another one coming up at the end of June. So feel free to just visit the ChildBright training page and sign up there. And of course, if you have any further questions, feel free to send me a note, get in touch, and we'll be happy to connect through that way. So again, Julia and Kate, thank you so much. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and mull over as we continue on this grand experiment of patient engagement and research.
Thank you.
Very much.
All right. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.